initiative, right?
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I thought since everything is always list the Gaelic with the English, I put my name up in Gaelic. Yeah, this is co-authored work with Paco Maderel and Isaac McFarlane. And we've been doing a lot of work for the Institute for Educational Sciences, which is sort of the grant funding wing of the U.S. Department of Education, on looking at this issue of what is the effect of public subsidies, or more generally tuition, on college attendance. We spent most of the last few years essentially doing GIS type work, mapping geographic boundaries for these taxing districts, which I'll talk about in a couple of seconds. For Texas over the last 20 years or so, and also using Freedom of Information Act type requests, getting tuition data from all the community colleges in Texas for the last 20 years as well. And what our main sort of focus is to look at these impacts of tuition subsidies using what is a variation in price or tuition between people who live in the college taxing district versus those who live out of the college taxing district. And we'll see that there's quite a bit of difference between the prices, but there's variation across all the different college taxing districts. And so that essentially is our key identification strategy that we're going to try to exploit. Now, we have a couple of data sets that we're focusing on. In one, we have the administrative data from Texas. Texas essentially tracks all its students in secondary school as well, and also as well as in colleges. And so we have roughly 2 million students that we've been tracking over time. It's a universe file. And then we also are looking at data from the census and the American community surveys. Now there are trade-offs between these two things, and this is why we've done or looked at both data sets. The census and the American community survey have very detailed information on where people live, whereas the data from the state of Texas, the administrative data, only knows essentially what high school or what junior high school you went to. Now you could use that as a proxy for where they live, but in some work that we're currently doing, we need something a little more narrow. In the census data, we can get down to a census block, which is roughly around between 100 and 200 people. So it's, it could be a building if it's a high rise, but it's very narrow in terms of geography. The only drawback of using the census and the American community surveys with this confidential data, not only do you have to be interviewed by the FBI, which is not too fun, but is that everything that you take out of this census data center has to be vetted with the census. And so it takes a long time between the time you actually do your estimations and get numbers out. So I'm still waiting on a bunch of results. I can, in general, tell you about it towards the end. Also, what we're going to do is not only look at sort of overall effects, but try to look at sort of heterogeneity, how much heterogeneity there are in these effects by different subgroups. In the census, for example, we can look at things like income differences, race, ethnicity. If in the administrative data, we can also look at things like ability differences using test score data. Today, though, what I'm going to focus on is mainly the results that we've been getting from the 90 and 2000 census data, and the ACS data from 2004 to 2010. And here we're focusing mainly on the effects of the tuition rate, or tuition subsidies, if you will, and I'll explain those differences a little later, on college enrollment. And I'll also explain what I mean in what the data is in the census and the ACS in terms of what you know about college enrollment. We do not, for example, know exactly what college you go to, which we would in the administrative data. And then looking at different subgroups and seeing whether there's any heterogeneity in the effects. Now, just a sort of brief overview about Americans in college, right? How do Americans pay for college? It's different than many European countries, although some European countries are moving more and more towards what it's like in the US. For example, tuition in Britain is now currently around £9,000. In the US, of course, students and families pay for tuition. And students may think that just because their parents are paying, they're not paying. Of course, when my kids went to college, and I ended up paying quite a bit, I told them that every dollar I spend in college is equal to the present value, or you're taking away the present value of your inheritance. So essentially, you're getting your inheritance up front. We have mean-tested grants from the federal government, Pell Grants. We have a big loan program. In fact, that's gotten a considerable amount of press lately. Roughly in the US, there is $1 trillion in outstanding student loans. Colleges have their own financial aid from various sources. Universities have endowment income, although this is pretty much mainly with either private institutions or selective public institutions, although with budget cuts to public institutions, now fundraising has become much more important. At Michigan, for example, we learned fairly early the importance of fundraising because of the big recession that affected the auto industry in the early 80s. And so currently our endowment is much larger than many or almost all public institutions, maybe except for like University of Texas that has oil money, but somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 billion. There's some tax relief, at least for certain middle-income groups, low and middle-income groups in the US that started around 1997, which helps subsidize college. But there's also public subsidies to colleges through mainly state appropriations. And that's one thing that we're going to mainly focus on today. Again, the amount of these subsidies is pretty much the main way that the government helps individuals pay. So, for example, in the US in 2012, there was about $7 billion in these sorts of subsidies through state appropriations. Usually what you see in the US is that when you have budget problems, the state tells the university it's going to cut back on the appropriations because they don't have enough money, and higher education is usually the first on the chopping block. But typically, although not always, they will allow you to offset those reductions by letting the universities raise their tuition level, the public universities. Also, the government, as I mentioned before, gives some aid via grants that are mean tested, the biggest program being the Pell Grant, which is in the neighborhood between 15 and maybe closer to 20 billion nowadays. State governments have their own grant aid, which is much less, roughly about half the size of the federal programs. Now, why would you think that it should be a way to provide subsidies through these across-the-board subsidies. Many people think that this is not a very wise way to do it because you're essentially subsidizing sort of inframarginal students who would have gone to college anyways, even if they hadn't got the subsidy. Maybe we could take that aid and better distribute it across low-income students. One reason why that this probably would never fly is that politically you're getting buy-in from huge groups of individuals by giving subsidies essentially across the board. If all college aid was geared to low-income students, a lot of the state governments would feel pressure from their voters to cut back because their kids or potential kids wouldn't benefit from it, yet they're paying taxes for it. And so it's a more politically viable option to do it in this fashion. Now, there's been research over the decades on looking at the effect of tuition rates. And the various types of research have had some design type of problems of essentially what they're using, what sources of variation they're using to identify the effect of college price on enrollment. Sort of the old-time literature started off looking at just cross-state variation in average tuition rates for public universities, and then seeing whether or not, for example, those states that have relatively low tuition rates, do we see relatively high college attendance rates. This sort of then improved to looking at this, instead of just having a single cross-section, having sort of a set of pooled cross-sections and looking at sort of variation within a state over time, i.e., this way you could control for state fixed effects and time effects, so you're really looking at deviations within a state over time to identify the effect. Both of those may suffer from certain types of problems. Mainly are there unobservables being correlated either in the cross-section with the sort of level in the error term or in the pooled cross-sections. Are unobservables, changes in the unobservables being correlated with changes in the tuition that might lead to biased estimates. And based on this research, there's been a sort of wide range of estimates, although in the largest estimate down below by Kane, that was actually mainly focusing on two-year colleges and not four-year colleges as well. What we're going to look at here is mainly community colleges in the U.S., which are colleges that award what we call associate degrees, which are two-year degrees. They may serve a transfer function. There are some students who, either because maybe they didn't try in high school or maybe they think it's a cheaper route, who have the intention of ultimately getting their bachelor's degree, start at a two-year college and at least hope to transfer to a four-year college at some point. And there's been a lot of evidence of whether this is a good route or not, and is it really a cheaper route, and so on and so forth. Now, the way that you hear this described in terms of there's many names for these sorts of institutions. They're either called community colleges or sometimes they're called junior colleges. A lot of times they're distinguished between two-year and four-year colleges, i.e. in the U.S. we also call what you would call in Europe universities. A lot of people just typically call them colleges, like just sort of lump all post-secondary education into colleges. So a lot of times the way they distinguish is they say a two-year college versus four-year college. There's about roughly 1,100 or so community colleges in the U.S. A lot of people go to community colleges, although a lot of them are older, non-traditional students, and many of them go part-time. So in sort of 2012, the fall enrollment, There are about 3.1 million full-time students in community colleges and about 4.6 million part-time. The average age is 28, so you can see that's a much older group. And it's also disproportionately non-white. About 49% of community college students are non-white. Tuitions are much cheaper than even the public four-year institutions. Average tuition in 2013-14 was about $3,300. For Michigan, in that year, if you were an in-state student, which you get cheaper tuition, it was more about somewhere in the neighborhood of $14,000. If you're out of state, add $20,000 to that. If you're going to a private school, you're more in that, especially if it's a selective, you're more in the $40,000 range a year, and that's without room and board. Again, these sorts of institutions were really designed to educate students on the margin between work and college, those who maybe have some deficits in skills. They have open admission policy. There's no selectivity whatsoever, although you may not be able to get a class because it's over too many people registered for it or whatever. It's, as I mentioned before, disproportionately ethnic minorities and low income. One thing that you see in two-year colleges, which you don't really see much, or at least it's less so in four-year colleges, that typically people go to the college that's closest to them, although with distance add and a couple of other things, this may not be as true as it used to be, but certainly the vast majority go to the closest community college. Higher ed, actually, over time, what we've been seeing in the U.S. is more and more students being willing to move across state to go to college, and also what we've been seeing is actually more foreign students coming to undergraduate graduate education. It's always been, we've always had a lot of foreign students, but undergraduate not so much until more recently. They also do other things too. In fact, in the US, a lot of the workforce development is sort of run through community colleges. There's not separate entities to do that. Also, there are classes where immigrants can take English as a second language. Now, what are community college taxing districts? Well, these are special purpose taxing districts in the US that if you live in this district, you pay, usually it's a fairly small amount in terms of property value, some sort of small percent of your, of the sort of assessed value of your house. And it's all the money that's collected, and this is why it's a special purpose taxing district, goes to help fund community colleges in that district. Now, the one payoff that people get for being taxed is that if you live in the college taxing district and you go to the community college in that taxing district, you typically get a lower tuition rate than if you don't live in the taxing district. It's similar to what we see in the US between states, right? So, for example, I mentioned Michigan. You know, many states are similar. My son just graduated a year ago from University of Colorado, Boulder. He mainly majored in snowboarding, but he also dabbled in history or something. But there, again, you know, the out-of-state tuition price was about $20,000 more a year. So a lot of states, and that's on the high end. Some states, what they'll do is they'll give you merit aid to try to lower that amount to attract good students, so you don't have to pay the full price. Others, even if you don't get merit aid, the price may be only a few thousand. So there's quite a bit of variation in that amount across states. But the same thing holds within Texas, which is the state we'll be looking at, is that if you live in a taxing district, you typically get a lower tuition rate than if you don't.
Brian, do you get lower if you attend a community college not in your taxing district, still in Texas? Is it a three-tiered tuition then? Sort of in-state but not within district, and then out-of-state, or is it
Typically, it's just two-tiered.
just within district and everybody else?
Yeah, so you'd just be paying the out-of-district price. So, for example, if you're on some border with Oklahoma or whatever, and you're going over to community college in Texas, you'd just pay the out-of-district price.
How long do you have to live someplace to get residency?
It varies by taxing district, but the vast majority of them is 1 year. You have to live there for 1 year before you can get the lower tuition. Now, Texas is a little different than many states. In some states, taxing districts fully cover the entire state, i.e., if you live somewhere, you're in at least one taxing district. Illinois is one example. So you can see these different areas here, which cover the entire state of Illinois, are different taxing districts. Texas, though, has some areas that aren't in any taxing district. In fact, geographically, it's most of the state, although population-wise, it's probably 60% of people are in taxing districts, 40% are out. So the blue or the dark areas here are the taxing districts in Texas. The sort of yellow areas are not in any taxing district. So there, if you wanted to go to community college, you're going to have to pay a higher price. Now, how big is Texas? Well, Texas is our second biggest state after California. It's about 27 million people. It's very diverse, although mainly the diversity comes through Hispanics. So there's about 12 million white non-Hispanics and 11 million Hispanics, 3 million blacks, and about 1 million of other ethnicities. The community college system there's about 67 public community colleges in Texas, contained within 50 of these community college taxing districts. So some districts have more than one community college within it. Plus there are, these are what we would consider the main campuses. There are satellite campuses, so that if they may rent out space in a high school somewhere and use that to have courses. More than half the students who go to higher ed in Texas go to community colleges. And to look at their sources of revenue, they get a lot from the taxes through these community college taxing areas, but it's not entirely the main source. It's about 30%. Here's for 2013. This would be through the taxes collected on property, about 31%. They still get appropriations from the state, as well as tuitions and fees, and other things. Some of these would be the Pell Grants coming in through the federal side of things. As we can see, though, these are the 50 different taxing districts. The green here is the in-district price, and the blue is the out-of-district price. You can note two things. First, that even focusing on in-district price, there's quite a bit of variation in that price. There's also quite a bit of variation in the difference between in-district and out-district price. If you look at just the differences here, here's a plot of the differences between in-district and out-of-district prices. Some that's very low, close to even a couple where it's actually zero. Others, for example, this is Austin, is very high. This is the variation that we want to exploit. We don't want to use any of the variation in the differences across districts, but more of this within variance in the in-district, out-of-district price. So briefly, I've already mentioned some of this before, is that this is, we track the boundaries using GIS data for about 20 years, from 91 to 2000. These boundaries change over time, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So there may be some ways to exploit that variation. So there may be, for example, high schools who 1 year aren't in a taxing district, who are, and maybe a couple years later, are in a taxing district due to an expansion. We've also, although we haven't used this data yet, we've also managed to locate not just the main community colleges, but all their satellite campuses. We did that using Freedom Information Act, asking them for their, not just their main campus, but their satellite campus locations. What we did was for every person in the data set, we know essentially with the census and ACS data, we know the census block that they live in, and from that we can measure the distance to every single community college. We also have it for the main as well as these supplementary type colleges. For every person, we know the distance. We also know how far you live from a taxing district, which I'll talk about a little later in terms of how to try to exploit that. So again, I'm going to talk about our results from the 90 and 2000 census as well as the 04 to 2010 ACS. The reason why we didn't use earlier years is that the ACS data sample sizes in the early years were pretty small. They were getting up going. The reason why they moved to the ACS is that there's no longer in the US a long form to the census, and this way they were hoping to get, instead of a snapshot every 10 years, smaller snapshots every year, but over the 10-year period adds up to essentially how many people would fill out the long form. One thing we're going to limit the sample to is we want to get rid of people in group quarters. What are group quarters? Well, the one thing that is in group quarters that concerns us is individuals who are living in dorms. The reason why is that in the census, when they interview a household, they don't ask that household, do you have any kids at college, right? They just look at who's in the household currently. And this, remember, in the census at least, the interviews are in April. So they actually consider a person living in a dormitory to be, in some sense, their own household, or at least living in a group quarters. Now, it turns out, actually, that the only year where this matters, which you cannot actually get individual data on group quarters. You can only get the group data. The census won't give it to you, but in 1990 you could get it. So we throw them out, and I'll explain how this may affect our estimates later. Now, we're looking at a particular group of individuals. We want to have people who essentially are able to go to community college, and so we're looking at those with high school diplomas and GEDs, but also we're going to focus on those who don't yet have any type of higher ed degree, so they don't already have a AA degree or a BA degree or a PhD or an MA or whatever. And so we're going to limit the sample to those individuals who don't have a degree, but from higher ed, but they have a high school diploma or a sort of a high school equivalency, the GED.
Are your results sensitive to that? Because, I mean, a lot of community colleges have a lot of programs that you don't need high school to attend. Like earlier, you mentioned the immigrant stuff. They have a lot of other stuff too, like the water basket week.
They don't tend to be very sensitive to that. We've run in a lot of different ways. I don't have the data out. It's in census, but our estimates are fairly robust. Also, we've even looked at it just restricting people to 18 and older, throwing in, because, people who, may have a PhD, may be rare, but some may feel the need to go back to college and get some sort of a degree and some practical type of, I'm just teasing, some practical type of skill. But yeah, and those, it tends to get washed out. I mean, the magnitude of the effects go down, but the significance stays the same because a lot of it is just adding sort of noise to it. The one thing that, and this is the drawback of this data, although we have very precise information on where you live, right, there's only a couple of questions in the census about attending school. They ask you essentially, have you attended school in the last 3 months? And if you answer yes, right, they ask you about the grade level attending, including college. And then they ask a further question of whether the school you're attending or college you're attending is a public or a private school. Okay. So what we were going to use, I'll just mainly focus on one. The estimates don't change much, but I'll focus on one set of estimates. My dependent variable in this analysis will be essentially, are you attending college? So it's just a dichotomous variable. Although we've done the same runs with the dichotomous variable, are you attending a public college? You get slight increases in the effects in some cases, but nothing substantially different. And so what we do is, again, we've merged essentially all this data from the GIS and the tuition data to these data sets in order to do our analysis. Now, I won't go over this in too much detail, but these are just some summary statistics. The one thing that's interesting, although some of this may be just a reporting error here, but what's been happening in Texas, it's becoming more and more Hispanic over time. In fact, it's probably now, or very shortly, Hispanics will become sort of the plurality in Texas. And again, the other thing here is that although a fair amount are born in Texas, a lot of people are coming into Texas from out of state.
So you only know if they're in the CC, whatever, at the same time they report whether they're in college. So
right.
If they move to go to college.
Well, we know on at least the ACS, we know if they lived in the same house or if they migrated in the previous year. In the census, we know in the previous 5 years. And so here I control for it, but I've run analyses just focusing on those who either haven't moved for 5 years or haven't moved for a year, and you get substantially the same results. So what we want to do is we want to isolate the tuition effect. And so the question is, how do we assign people who aren't in any community college taxing district? We need to assign them to a taxing district. And we do this by just choosing the one that's closest to them. And using this as a proxy for if you were to go to college, a community college, this would be the one you go to. Now, we've done it a couple of ways. We've assigned either the closest taxing community college taxing district boundary, and we've also assigned, the closest community college and the taxing district that that's in, and we get fairly similar results. So this is going to be just the closest to whatever the closest boundary is the one that we'll assign to you. And so from that, we can get a tuition rate for you depending on where you live. If you live in the taxing district, of course, that's the closest one, and you get the low rate. And then if you live outside and we're only looking at people who live outside all districts and exploring that variation, but they get assigned the taxing district that's closest to them in terms of the boundaries. And that's the variation that we're going to exploit. So we still have variation in this tuition rate, even though we're going to put in community college taxing district fixed effects for a single year, right? So we're taking out these fixed effects, we'll take out any sort of variation across districts in some sort of average price and just use the differential in the district versus out-of-district price. And at least in these regressions that are reported today, we've controlled for how far you are from a community college. And this is important because there are some work that neglects this, and in this case, we need to be sure to control for it, because certainly it's going to vary with tuition, because people who are outside the taxing district on average are going to be further away, and we want to distinguish it from a distance type problem, i.e. people who live further away from any community college are going to be less likely to go to college. We'll see that. But we don't want to, put that bias of tuition estimate by neglecting that. And then we control for your sort of usual demographics, including birthplace. Our sort of proxy for income is poverty level measured according to your previous year's income. Mental status, we have a bunch of different types of controls for migration. Whether you migrated across, they don't ask you, did you migrate into a taxing district? The best we can do is sort of county level migration. But we know whether they migrated within a county, across a state. Various disability, they differ a little across the year, but they're mainly similar on disability status in terms of work disability, and also how tied are you to the labor market in terms of your previous weeks of work in the previous year.
Do you think of poverty level as being a household attribute or an individual attribute?
Well, here, this is the household poverty level. That's broken down into 6 levels. The reason why we do this, the 6 levels we'll see, the poorest level is less than 100% of the poverty level, which of course depends on the family size. But we'll see that this is another area where, students who live, say, off campus in student housing, they're not in group quarters, they're their own household. They're going to only ask about their income. Many of those kids are going to be considered in the poverty level. And so some of this we'll be getting at in a different way, but part of it, by breaking apart income groups, the result we get for that sort of poor group, we want to be a little cautious about because of that sort of effect going on. Now with the ACS data, we sort of pooled it because the sample sizes each year aren't that great. Now we're not taking out complete variation, i.e. I could actually, and I have some results, and it doesn't change much, but you could do the two-way effect of time and fixed effect. But for the ones I report now, it preserves some of the power, although the point estimates are pretty robust. It's just put in time dummies and community college taxing district dummies. So here is the estimates for the 90 census. Now in the paper, actually I had 18 and older, but I've got released recently data where I broke it apart a little more cleanly. And you can see here that these are just distance to just show you that matters. There's a bunch of other stuff that I don't point out. Although it's negative here, it's not significant that for 25 and older, it's significant in about a 4 percentage point decrease for $1,000. These are measured in thousands of dollars for a $1,000 increase. Of course, this is in $1990. And then for the 2000, we're actually getting a fairly large negative effect for tuition, both especially for the 18 to 24-year-olds, and then a somewhat smaller effect for the 25 and older, but significant. So this is about a 5.4% decrease for a $1,000 increase, and this is about a 1.2% decrease. Then finally, for the ACS, we have something that's negative but insignificant, as well as significant negative effect around 0.5% for the, oops, that should be 25 and older, sorry, for this group. Now, we were sort of, in our first sort of pass at this, you might think, well, these, especially something like that doesn't seem sort of surprising. Well, there's a couple of things that are going on. There may be other reasons why there's variation across or differences inside the taxing district versus outside the taxing district. And so what we would try to think of is, can we at least adjust for that, i.e. for other stuff that may affect going to college, which is related to being in a taxing district versus not, and which may be biasing our tuition effect. And so one thing that we did...
Can I ask a question? The tuition variable, is that the sticker price?
Yeah.
So the kids may not actually be paying that.
Right. And again, when we do the income breakdowns, you know, notice that there is no the only aid that students typically get for going to community college is Pell Grant type aid and maybe some state aid, right? It's not like 4 years where there's other stuff.
No merit aid?
No merit aid at all. And so when we do the income breakdowns, you know, if we look outside the first couple of groups, which I'll explain in a couple minutes, we'll see that even for the higher income groups who we know aren't getting any aid, they're ineligible for Pell, that there's going to be actually some fairly sizable negative effects.
So the measurement error, if you think about the difference between the sticker price and what they actually pay, that's a kind of measurement error.
Right.
That's going to be correlated with income, is that right?
Right, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure to break it down by income groups. Mainly, our worry is the Pell Grant, i.e., if tuition goes up, your Pell Grant may go up, right? And that may offset the tuition increase for very low income groups. There also may be some crowd out. Now, we can't get at this in our data because we don't know what type of college you went to. In our other data, the administrative data, we're going to look at this more precisely. We can see whether people, you know, are switching from 4-year to 2-year, i.e., is a cheaper price for a 2-year causing some people who would have gone to 4-year to now go to 2-year instead, which may be a problem, although I don't know the exact details of the Obama proposal, but Obama claiming to make, you know, or wanting to make community college tuition free may have some undesirable consequences if it's going to cause some kids from 4 years, since now 2 years free, to go to 2-year instead. The other thing we're doing, and we've been working on this for a while, we're doing some RD type, looking at the boundaries of the taxing district to look at tie-about sorting in terms of looking at property values across the boundaries. Now, the thing that you must note is that this has been done, like by Sandy Black and others, that mainly looking at school districts, i.e. Sort of K through 12 or primary and secondary, where people are more likely to locate based on the school. Right. Well, it turns out that there is some overlap between taxing districts, community college, and school district boundaries for primary and secondary. But we know that there is quite a bit of boundary where there is no overlap. And so what we're doing is we're only using the boundaries that don't align with the school district. So you might have a person who's in the same school district, right? One person in a taxing district and another not in a taxing district. And we're using those sorts of boundaries to try to look at changes in property values solely coming about through the community college taxing district.
Presumably you still worry, especially for older people, that if they plan to go to community college and they're, you know, choosing to rent an apartment, they'll choose to rent one within a district rather than outside.
Right. No, that's the best we can do with the census data is just to throw out, you know, either control or to throw out those who moved within a year or 5 years with the 90 and 2000. And we also have problems with that. All we know is the high school that you went to in the administrative data, or we can go back even to their junior high school, assuming they were in Texas at that point, and look at those as controls.
You also, you have some people in the sample who live hundreds of miles from a community college area.
Yeah, those are, actually, we've thrown out people who've lived further than 50 miles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, the other way, what we're going to try to do is to get rid of these other things that may affect whether you go to a community college or not, or excuse me, other things that may be related to the taxing district that aren't tuition, that cause you to be more or less likely to go to a community college. And to do this, we're going to kind of switch the sign. We're going to talk in terms of subsidy rather than tuition, where if you pay the out-of-district price, we're going to say you get a zero subsidy. Now, it's not really true because there's state appropriations that you're benefiting off of, but in some sense, relative to the person who lives in the district, you get a zero subsidy. So the subsidy effect is only going to be non-zero for those who live in a district, and it's just the difference between the out-of-tuition and in-tuition price. So if you live in a district where out-of-district tuition is $500 more, then by living in the district, we're going to say you get a $500 subsidy. So in this case, we're going to then look at the subsidy, and I don't have the results. I've done it a few ways. I only have one set of results that have been released. But what we're going to do is we're going to say that there may be other things affecting whether you go to community college, and this could be realized in taxing districts, for example, where you see very low subsidies, close to zero, and there are some where are actually zero, right, versus those with really high subsidies. So we're going to try to sort of use the low subsidy groups as a control and look at the difference between high subsidy and low subsidy to try to parse out the true tuition effect or the subsidy effect. And so in this breakdown here, we've just done below or above the median subsidy. In other ones, we've just put a dummy in for whether you're in a district or not, and then just used various polynomials of how much subsidy you're getting. The results are somewhat similar. So we're going to define you as a high subsidy group if you're in a district that sort of gives you an above median subsidy for the various years that you're in across all subsidies. And this way, we can identify this effect in addition to putting in essentially a dummy variable for whether you live in a community college taxing district, hoping that the coefficient associated with this variable, where is it here? Right here, this theta, is sort of picking up all the other stuff that may be different across living in a district versus out of district and related to whether you go to school or not. And then the effect of it truly having a high subsidy is being identified off of this alpha. Now, it's going to be hard to interpret this alpha because it's not a dollar, it's just a below or above the median, although I'll talk about results that haven't got released yet that actually allow you to convert it into a percentage number based on $1,000 change. So when we do this, the only thing you'll notice is the signs are switching because subsidies are good things. So the more you get, the more likely you're to go. And so we can see in the 90 census, those in high subsidy districts are about 5% relative to low subsidy districts, about 5% more likely, and about 0.7% more likely for the 25 and older group. Here is the 2000 census. It's about a 6.9% difference if you live in a high subsidy district versus low in terms of going to school, and about a 0.5 percentage point for older individuals, and then about roughly 3% in the ACS data, and again, roughly a 0.5% in the 25 and older. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I wanted to get through one thing that I've sort of glazed over is, and it's not in the paper because we just got these released, is that, again, we're worried about these individuals who are essentially students who are their own household. So we've thrown out those who are in dorms, but of course, like in Michigan, probably the majority of first-year students live in dorms, but after that, everybody moves off campus. And so what we're doing in this new set of estimates to try to get rid of some of this, and again, this is then going to, these tuition effects then are more going to be related to sort of two-year colleges and four-year, is we know where you live, so we're going to throw out everybody who lives within 2 miles of a university, a four-year university, right, to try to get rid of a lot of the students who are their own household living off campus and going to a four-year university. Now, we've also done it with a four-year radius, and we got roughly the same results, although we're throwing out a larger number, and it's a little more noisy, but they're still significant. So what we're doing here, these are the results now where we're restricting people, only looking at people who live more than 2 miles from a four-year university. Again, now we're going back to tuition, not subsidy. So again, these are just tuition effects. Remember that these were not terribly significant when we had those people in, but now we're getting about a 6.9% decline for 18 to 24-year-olds, 3.8 percentage points for 25 and older. In the 2000, it's a 9.2% decline, and about a 1.3% decline for older students. And then finally, in the ACS, it's about a 3.3% decline for 18 to 24-year-olds, and a 0.5% for 25 and older. We've done the same thing for subsidies, although this is probably the only one that's not really significant in the 90. Again, we're getting fairly strong positive effects here for the 2000 census as well as for the 2004-2010 ACS. Now, when we do these subsidies with a linear effect with a dummy rather than above median, below median, we get very similar results to what we find, only the signs switch with the tuition, i.e. the dummy variable for living in district, out of district, for most of the cases is not significant, although in a couple it is, but doesn't change the estimated impact by very much. Now, this is the other breakdown that I wanted to show you for heterogeneous effects. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get released the data where you have to live more than 2 miles from a four-year with the poverty breakdowns. They're still being processed. But we break it down into these 6 different groups. What we're worried about is for this group here, there's probably 2 things going on that's going to be maybe corrupting our results, is that A, they might be college students because they're living away from home, and B, even if they're not, there may be sort of at least a partial Pell Grant offset. So if tuition goes up, your Pell goes up, so your net price stays the same, or it goes up by a much smaller fraction. Actually, the Pell problem is going to go away after these, essentially these first 3 groups. If you're at 300% of the poverty level, you're not, even with a family of 4, you're not eligible for any Pell Grant. This has some eligibility. You're about 100% eligible here for Pell, everybody in the poverty or below, and these groups are some partial but declining eligibility for Pell. But the last 3 groups are not eligible for Pell. So when we look at this, we get these kind of strange results up here, and some of this is going to be due, especially for that 2 mile problem. Actually, when I exclude people, even though I haven't had the results with me, when I exclude people who are within 2 miles of a four-year, these effects, they remain positive, but essentially the significance goes away, the point estimates. So some of that estimate is being driven by that. Notice here that our strong negative results start occurring, although these aren't significant, but they are here. Actually, with the 2 mile people living within 2 miles thrown out, these actually all become significant, especially for the 300 and above the poverty level, who we know aren't getting Pell Grants. For the 2000 census, we start getting significance even at the 200% level and above, highly negative in both cases. And it stays the same, gets a little stronger when we throw out those who are within 2 miles of a four-year. And then similarly with the ACS data, has another way to check it. So we're more confident in these results here than we are. These, again, are being corrupted by 2 reasons. These are probably being corrupted for a couple of reasons. or one reason, the Pell, and then these are people who are, unless, there may be rich students out there who have their own income, like a trust fund baby who got a trust fund early on and has very high income. But that's probably very rare. Now, let me just explain before I end what we're doing currently is where, with the other data, as I mentioned before, we're looking at a couple of things. We have merged on the UI wage, quarterly wage data to this 2 million individuals, so we can track those individuals as long as they stay in Texas into the labor market. And so we can look at sort of long-run labor market consequences of this. We can look at this 2-year, 4-year choice and whether or not, some of the effect is simply people choosing not to go to 4-year and go to 2-year instead, or is it simply people on the margin of no college 2-year that we're seeing, so we can get that kind of parsed out. We can also, using test score data, especially if we focus it in everybody in 11th grade has to take sort of an exit exam in Texas, and so we can look at that data as a proxy for ability level or at least achievement level and look at that. The other thing we're doing is we're looking only at individuals around the boundaries, and in particular boundaries that aren't school boundaries, and looking at both this tie-about type of sorting, is that going around, but also looking at the effects of the tuition differential using, now here we're going to have to use a 2-dimensional RD because these boundaries look weird. You might be very close to the boundary outside the district versus somebody who's very close inside the district, but they may be really far from each other because one's on one side of the taxing district and the other's on the other, and some of these taxing districts are fairly large. And also, you might think that might average out around the boundaries, but the way that you have this clustering of people living in density problems, it's much easier to try to deal with that by doing a 2-dimensional RD to try to isolate individuals who are both close to the boundary but also close to each other. The other thing we're doing is looking at trying to exploit this change in the boundaries over time using a difference in difference estimation. There are several changes that we've examined, and we're going to look at not only what happens to enrollment in terms of individual students, that's sort of on the demand side, but also looks what happens to the colleges. And actually, this was Isaac who found this. There was an expansion in Bowie County in Texas of a taxing district, and what they found was that the amount of property that was eligible to be taxed went from 1.3 billion to 5.1 billion after the expansion. So they brought in a lot more households into the taxing district. Now the question is, well, now from a community college standpoint, these individuals, if they go, are going to pay a lower tuition, and therefore your revenues are going to fall on that margin, right? But if you have enough of an increase in the numbers of individuals going, that may make up for it. And so this is just sort of anecdotal. What they found that the balance tipped to a revenue increase, that even, allowing for the fact that more individuals may pay less if they go, they still came up $4 million ahead in terms of their revenue because it's tended to be more than offset by the number of individuals going increasing. Okay, so that's it. Any further questions?
What we were saying on the previous one is the fact that they had what's offsetting it is they taxed all these bunch more houses, right?
Right, and there's that too. You're right. Yeah.
That's what I think would be the biggest change.
Right, and what we're going to do is try to parse out all three of those. How much is due to getting more taxes? We do have actually, at the community college level, we've spent quite a bit of time getting very detailed, more detailed than you get in iPads, on their sort of balance sheets for this 20-year period, and then we're going to use that to look more on the supply side. We also, as I mentioned, we also know not only do they expand their taxing districts, we have sort of dated all their expansions in terms of new community colleges, and in particular these sort of satellite campuses. We know the dates, we have the dates of when those come into existence, and some of them actually go out of existence. They're temporary, but others are fairly persistent. So we're going to look at, what do they do? Do they then expand? And so we're going to look at that in more detail from sort of the community college side of the thing rather than the student side.